All right. Thank you all for coming. I know there's some that are joining by Zoom. We have a very exciting panel today. We're going to start by doing a little mental exercise, and that is I want you to think of something very happy, something that makes you happy. And then when I say the word tax, I want you to think of it again. This is this is not going to be a boring panel. This is going to be an exciting panel because tax is what's going to finance the future of human rights. So, my name is Rachel Miner. I'm the founder and CEO of Bellwether International, and I'll be co-moderating this with my wonderful moderator here, Father Charles. And we have an amazing lineup. We're going to do very brief bios so we can get right into the meat of the discussion today. We have on the end Eric LeCompte. He's the executive director of Jubilee USA. We have Antonio Freitas, the Undersecretary of International Finance with the Ministry of Finance here in Brazil. It's an honor to have you, sir. Thank you for joining. We have Anne, who's to my left, the program development manager of All Africa Conference of Churches, and as I mentioned, Father Charles, who is the director of Justice and Ecology Office with the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar. Now, with that being said, those happy thoughts and images in your mind, let's talk a little bit about tax and the role that taxes play in human rights, and we'll dive right into our discussion. Taxes are fundamentally how we raise revenue to finance the social infrastructure of our world. Without tax, there is no education, there is no public health, there is no roads, there is no government, there is no joint efforts to protect and promote human dignity as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, although we all of us have this negative reaction to tax, our first mission today is to help you to start thinking about tax as a resource, a tool that we can use to protect global human rights. And we need to think about just tax. When governments fail to raise a just tax, we're actually adding to the burden of human rights. We're actually destabilizing economies, and we're making the whole process of protecting and promoting human rights, we're putting that burden on civil society, which becomes more expensive in the long run and more inefficient. Economists would call this a market failure. So tax is where it starts. Why are and where are tax systems currently failing human rights? Well, we're either raising too much or too little through taxes, or we're not taxing the right populations, which we're going to talk about with our panelists. There's also disincentives if you tax at the wrong time or in the wrong ways. This can lead to lower investment in the short run and in the long run. Tax revenues should also be strategically spent by government because they have the potential to boost GDP and foster economic growth. The largest failure, though, currently in the tax system are two words that everyone here should know that were recently taught to me by a specialist in international tax law, who I'm very grateful for, and that is the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax avoidance is the strategic work that multinational corporations do to place their profits, investments, and sales in tax havens, in places where they don't have to pay the most tax. Tax avoidance is not always illegal. Tax avoidance is costing us trillions of dollars, but it's harder to enforce if we don't know what we're looking for. Tax evasion, on the contrary, is completely illegal, and we know how it happens, and it primarily happens through wealthy individuals who are at all costs avoiding taxes of any kind. So just to give you a sense of the problem statement and what we're up against, we are currently on course to lose $5 trillion to tax avoidance. $5 trillion to tax avoidance from multinational corporations and wealthy individuals. The future losses of this money, $5 trillion, is equivalent to losing a year of worldwide spending on public health. Imagine if overnight all of the public health in the world disappeared, $5 trillion. That's the scale of tax avoidance that we're talking about. If we continue to also abuse taxes with tax evasion, we will lose an additional 480 billion taxes a year in abuse. It's really hard to conceptualize these numbers, but let me just say in short, it is a lot of money. we could be way more effective. In fact, tax compliance efforts, working on existing laws, using existing rules to reclaim tax avoidance, is one of our greatest strategies. Okay, now let's come into the room and talk about what we're going to discuss on our panel today, and that is the current landscape between tax reform and international human rights. We are in a very exciting moment. I'm being serious. There is such a thing as an exciting moment for the tax world. Just 1 year ago, the OECD adopted an international tax rate, which means that the tax avoidance that is happening by multinational corporations cannot happen in OECD countries. They're trying to standardize tax rates so that they're not undercutting the competition. The bad news is that for those of you who work in international human rights work, the OECD represents a very small group of countries. And so the Global South is still disproportionately bearing the burden of tax avoidance. So after the laws were reformed last year, the Global South has spoken up. Countries like Brazil and others have said, this is not going to work for us. So they've proposed to the United Nations a convention on the tax. So just like there's a convention on the rights of the child, there is now negotiations happening about convention on a global tax standard. And this standard really could revolutionize the ways we think about financing human rights through taxes. If we were to reclaim some of the lost revenues from tax avoidance, particularly through a shared international tax standard, we could raise $220 billion yearly. $220 billion yearly. The UK has expected that it will get $4 billion from its compliance with the new OECD tax competition rates. So what we're going to talk about now is a combination of factors that lead into this. First, what is inequality in tax reform look like? How do we address this with a human rights lens? How do we address this with an interfaith lens? And then we're going to talk about this policy window of opportunity, because as of 2 days ago, the initial terms of reference that were designed in the UN Convention on the Tax were adopted by the United Nations. Negotiations will continue this fall. Only 8 countries voted against the initial terms of reference. All 8 are members of the OECD. So there's an opportunity here to discuss this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over now to my co-moderator, Father Charles, to start the discussion with our panelists around the question, what is inequality in the tax reform landscape, and how should we start to be thinking about these questions? Father Charles, to you.
As my co-moderator has explained, tax is important for as a mechanism for raising money that governments should be spending. But taxes also can be used to reduce inequalities, which should be a concern for all of us. And that's one of the main reasons why there's a lot of conversation around tax reform, is to reduce the disparities that exist in the world today. And they are quite bad. I just want to mention a few. You know them, but I just want to reiterate those, so to help us kickstart a conversation, because that helps us also to see the ethical justice dimensions of the topic we are addressing, that it is beyond money, it is beyond finances, but it's about human beings. It's about living well. How can we use taxation to help us live well and live better? Just a few statistics that you already know. That a mere 26 individuals, whom we can fit in this room very, very well, have income equal to almost 4 billion of the world. Think about that. 26 human beings whom we can fit here in this room have income equal to 4 billion people of the world. And that the world's richest 1% have more than 1%, that's about maybe 70 people. They have more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion combined. And you know, the others have to do with access, like while in America or in Europe, 80% of people can have access to healthcare easily. Only 20% in Africa can do that. And one can argue that it's the problems of Africa, but we can also argue that it's also problems of global governance because we have 89 billion dollars that should be spent, that can be raised every year and could be spent well on healthcare that goes out of Africa to the rich countries. Now, as we heard yesterday from Mrs. Mary Robinson, all of these should outrage us. And we should use this anger, this holy anger, to address this. And including us, people of faith, should feel bad about this, should be angry about this, not because of our interest, but because this affects human beings. This means others can live and others can't live. And maybe let's start with you, Eric. We are here as faith people, interfaith groups. As I've mentioned, there's a human face to this conversation. It's more than money. Um, why should we be concerned about this as faith leaders and faith communities?
Thank you, Father Charlie. We're dealing with a reality in sub-Saharan Africa where 1 out of 5 kids dies from preventable diseases, right? That is still the numbers that we're dealing with. And the numbers that Father Charlie broke down so well and Rachel broke down so well, I think are very powerful when we're asking, why does the faith community care? Well, the faith community all over the world is on the front lines of helping people, of providing social infrastructure, and particularly in the developing world where too many countries lack infrastructure, it's the faith community that comes in and provides healthcare, education, social services. So we have a direct interest as faith leaders. I think the reality that we're dealing with is that when we look at tax avoidance, tax evasion, corruption, what's also known as illicit financial flows, debt payments, rising interest rates, the numbers range between a loss in the developing world between $1 and $3 trillion annually, right? Conservatively, $1 trillion. But we look at all of those things. So a big focus of our time together has been on sustainable development, human rights, the money we need to stop human trafficking, the money we need to save our world and heal our planet. All of these are primary concerns of the faith community, in addition with ending global child poverty in our lifetime. And when we look at the real numbers, we have enough money to be able to deal with these challenges. So I think one of the things that we're looking at as people of faith, because even as people of faith, none of us like paying our taxes. But when the wealthiest people in the world are not paying their fair share of taxes, when they have more wealth than more than half of the world's global population, when there is evasion, corruption, and avoidance taking place, and countries then have to take out more debt to get by on terms of being able to meet basic needs of their people, we're looking at something that's egregious in terms of inequality. So our sense is that this is, as people of faith have been the backbone of pretty much every powerful social movement we've seen historically, we have a moral demand on us to continue to work on this, but it's in our self-interest in a sense that we're trying to pick the bodies out of the river that are coming out all over the world by, providing social infrastructure, but we don't have enough to do it. And by dealing with tax evasion, tax avoidance, progressive taxation, and the taxation on the wealthiest individuals, we can say we have the money we need. We don't have to ask, show me the money. We already know where the money is to deal with the greatest challenges of our lifetime.
Thank you very much, Eric. And like I said, um, taxation can either help bridge the inequality gaps or it can exacerbate those. And we have seen examples of this globally, but also in the countries, leading to unrest and turmoil. And one recent example is Kenya, where uh, already existing tax laws and tax systems were hurting the poor, but there was an introduction of tax systems allegedly imposed from the IMF or wherever were hitting even more the people, and we saw how that led to unrest and killing of people. And here you are from Kenya, and you followed that story. You are within Kenya. Could you just maybe highlight a few things and show to the listeners what that looks like in real life, so that it's not just textbook issues that we're talking about here?
Thank you very much, Father Chilufya, for introducing that topic. It's indeed, and I agree with my fellow panelists, that unjust tax systems have led to civil unrest. You've all been following the international media, even the local media, and seen what has been happening in Kenya. Yes, we do agree that taxation is good. It's for domestic resource mobilizations. Our president have been telling the people that we want to be self-reliant. We don't want to borrow. We are already overburdened with debt. But how do we pay this debt? Is by raising our resources domestically. But as even my co-moderator here has talked about the abuse of human rights, we've seen people being kidnapped because of demanding for fairness. Just like my fellow presenter talked about where the money is. Yes, we collect taxes, but we're not seeing the services. People have been denied services. People are lacking medicine in hospitals. Teachers are not being paid. You've heard that even the doctors are on strike. You heard the medical interns were sleeping at the Ministry of of Health offices the whole night demanding for payment. Yet every year, every month, Kenyans pay taxes. But where are those taxes? The taxes are misappropriated because of corruption, because of loopholes that in the system. And that's why this panel is very, very important in demanding for those tax reforms and demanding for just systems that are going to make sure that when taxes are collected, the services are delivered to the people. When you are denied services, your rights, your human rights are infringed upon. And that's why you've seen the Kenyan people, they are rising up, especially the young generation, saying enough is enough. We want fairness, we want just system, we want to get services for what we pay for. Last year, the government also introduced the housing levy, which was accepted. But this time they came with another finance bill that was rejected. Why? Because already the citizens, they are feeling that they are being overtaxed, but they're not seeing services are not being delivered to them. And that's why they rose up and said enough is enough. And the good thing is that also the president listened to the cry of the people. When the young people demanded the cabinet to be dissolved, it was dissolved. Although I was speaking to Father Chilufya, if you look like 2 days ago, the newly appointed finance minister is saying he's going to introduce even more punitive taxes. That's why we need these reforms. And we need the religious leaders to raise up and demand for justice and for fairness in the tax system.
Thank you very much, Anne. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Anne. Um, Let me turn to you, Antonio. You're from the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. And we also know that inequality is not just bad for people, it's also bad for the economy. The economy won't do well and it will hurt more where there's inequality. And Pope Francis has been calling for the last 10 years for an economy that heals, an economy that brings life rather than an economy that heals. Why should the government be concerned about inequality, to heal inequality and so that we can build an economy that is stable and can provide life? You can also make some references to Brazil that has made great strides in reducing inequality over the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. I'd like to greet the organizers, the panelists, and the audience. I'd like to congratulate you for your introductory remarks also, which we fully agree. with your statements. Actually, the Brazilian government, both internally and externally, has been working hard to use taxation to reduce inequality and to avoid, at least to limit, to minimize the discrepancies that exist between social groups and individuals. They are increasingly growing, especially after the pandemic, and we have to work on that. So today's world faces great challenges, as you know. Official development aid is falling. Military spending is on the rise everywhere. High interest rates are draining savings from peripheral countries to central countries. There was a sharp increase in interest rates by mid-pandemics. There is increase in the debt service and the debt burden on the poorest countries, also on individuals. We are facing a climate crisis. We are a species that is consciously heading for disasters without proper collective action. This is very important to have in mind, and the Brazilian government is keen to work on this on several international and internal aspects of its activities. I firmly believe that religion and dialogue between religions is one of the ways to overcome impasses between nations, wars, and other threats. We need to build bridges, and this is one of Brazil's best diplomatic traditions. So, within the G20, which we are presiding this year, fighting inequalities is at the center of our work. It's our central priority. And internally, the tax reform we are discussing with Congress, we hope to approve it in the coming months. Also has been designed to decrease inequalities. Inequalities, trying to reply to your answer, it decrease economic growth. It's an inefficient, unjust tax system, decrease economic growth. It's inefficient. It has a very well-known relation with growth patterns and the growth in income and wealth distribution. It's also a question of justice, of fairness, of agreed rules for social movement between classes. I mean, we have to have a basis, and we have to have a top, and people should be allowed, according to their work, according to their merits, or according to the opportunity and circumstance, or their willingness to move within the social scale. And taxation is one of the tools for that. It's also a political issue related to the concentration of power and the ability to influence elections or media or think tanks and other actors that shape our current political and economic structure. It's a moral issue also, as Eric and others have highlighted. Widespread poverty coexistent with opulence. This is a moral issue, and it's strong in Brazil. It's strong in other developing countries, but also in developed economies, also in the richest economies. The disparities, for example, in the U.S. and in other countries, are very shocking. This has been reflected in our international work in G20 documents, debates, and proposals, specifically in the structuring of a mechanism to fight hunger and poverty, which is one of the main priorities of Brazil in the G20, the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which has been approved in July, and which now we are working to provide ways of financing and to become operational starting on November, when we'll have the Leaders Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Also on debt, we have been working hard. Recently, I was talking to Eric here. Minister Fernando Haddad went to the Vatican to discuss debt issues, debt in the developing world, with several world leaders, academics, thinkers. And I was there also in May. It was a very important experience for us. And I'm proud to say that our minister was personally there as chair of the G20, listening and making statements on the need to urgently tackle this issue. Also on climate finance, we have been working at the G20, but I think our main central topic of the finance track of the G20 that we have been working, and you probably heard about, is the proposal to tax billionaires, high net worth individuals, which has been a landmark proposal that we have been working since the beginning of the year, and we are proud to have approved a declaration in July by all the G20 members. It was a declaration that has I think 14 or 15 paragraphs of new language, international new language. I mean, why is this important? Because when you are negotiating international declarations, you always can take advantage of agreed language from the past. You take language from the UN, from some declarations, and we build a new an original declaration on international taxations that includes the taxation of billionaires from zero. So we are very proud of this. Of course, we don't have a proposal which is to be we have a proposal, but we don't have something that will be adopted and implemented in the next 6 months on taxation, international taxation of billionaires. I mean, countries have different views, countries have different understandings, but we put the issue in the agenda, we put the issue in the press. The issue is being discussed at the UN. In the negotiations of the UN Framework Convention. We just returned from that. We have Poliana here, our advisor, just returned from New York. She was there fighting for the inclusion of taxation of billionaires and also of millionaires, if possible, isn't it? On the global agenda. So our proposal, very briefly before we can start having our debate here, is a step-by-step approach which involves technical support from international organizations, academics, and civil society. A first step would be to establish definitions of high net worth individuals and mapping its taxation rates around the world. So first we have to have a more precise and detailed definition of who they are, where they are, and how they are being taxed around the world. The second initiative aims to establish a policy menu of alternatives and facilitating coordination and promoting best practices. The third step would be to enhance coordination, transparency, and exchange of information to tackle tax avoidance and evasion. So we don't want to put tomorrow a 2%, well, that was the proposal of Professor Gabriel Zuckman, a 2% tax on billionaires, because we lack political circumstance to implement it. And of course, on international taxation cooperation, you know that there's always the issue that if you put it too much here, a capital can fly to other countries, can fly elsewhere, can disguise itself, and so on. So international cooperation is fundamental in this regard. But we made a very important first step in our presidency, culminating in the declaration of July, the Rio Declaration. And now we are working at the UN. We're discussing with other international partners. We are taking the discussions to the IMF and to the World Bank. And I think taxation is, as was highlighted, is a matter of democracy. It's a matter of justice. It's a political issue. So you don't have only to pay attention to how money is spent, which is normally what the financial markets, the bankers, and international institutions, they are always trying to have the primary surplus and the fiscal deficits under control. You also have to tackle how you're raising this money and how it affects different sectors of society. So Brazil, with all its strength, is working hard for this, both internally and externally. So that would be my preliminary remarks here. And thank you again for the invitation. We're very happy to be able to have this dialogue with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for that elaboration of what the Brazilian G20 presidency has been able to do. Specifically, you pointed out that proposal from Professor Zuckman on the taxation of wealthy individuals. Maybe just under a minute or two, could you say more about, there has been a little bit of resistance from the wealthy countries, just as we have had some resistance on the terms of reference. Could you say just a little bit more about how Brazil is sort of responding to this? Because it's been disappointing that the wealthy countries who should support this out.
Well, we had support for our declaration. We built it carefully. We had a number of bilateral meetings. We organized a tax symposium here in May in Brasilia, where we brought the delegations. And There's widespread popular support around the world. Polls indicate that 70% of the world's population approves or are in favor of taxing more progressively, billionaires especially. And yes, there is resistance. There is something new. They don't know exactly what Brazil wants, what's behind it, or also there are resistance that come from those that historically manage the taxation discussion internally. So they kind of feel that there is some, not intrusion, but we are opening some avenues that normally were confined within the control of certain organizations or country or powerful actors. And so we kind of opened it. Of course, the UN Framework Convention approval, which was led by the African Union and the African countries with the support of Latin America and strong support by Brazil, was also
last week,
it was approved last year, and last week's were one round of the discussions. One important round of the discussions was held in the recent weeks. So, of course, internally, countries have their own different views. Normally you have the liberals that say that the wealthy, the billionaires, they deserve to be wealthy. If you tax them, you are promoting, disincentivizing people to be entrepreneurs, to be bold, to be aggressive in their business. We know this narrative lacks substance, lacks concreteness, and it's, I won't say immoral, but it's unfair. It's unfair. It benefits those that are at the top, and most of them, as we could analyze, inherited their fortunes, inherited their companies, and so on, or they benefit from excellent and extremely well prepared private schooling and social contact, social networking, and so on. So we have to make this narrative also this political dispute with a larger share of the population. And I think this is a matter that, although there are resistance by the institutional actors, it's something that is, the right is not against it in many cases. The left also is not against it. So you have strong support, but takes time internationally. Our colleagues here mentioned the taxation of multinationals, the minimum level of taxation, that it's still yet to be fully in place. It took how many years? It took 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, maybe. So 10 years, maybe, isn't it? So let's keep this avenue
momentum
open and let's invest in it. It's our willingness, and we count on support. We have been strongly coordinated with Africa, other Latin American countries, Asian countries, and also some countries, European countries. I can mention Spain is fully supporting us, South Africa, in Africa also, who will be the next G20 presidency. So I think we have to keep the good job for the moment, and we have a political tool to make democracies and our social structures more fair.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We are discussing tax reforms at the global level, and we just started looking at one of the thorny issues there that could be addressed by good taxation, which is inequality. And we want now to advance the conversation on what these reforms look like and what is happening, and I'll ask my co-moderator to take that forward.
Yeah, we've touched on some really important themes. And you've mentioned at the local level that is taxes enough if there's corruption? Maybe not so. Antonio, you've highlighted not only the structures, but the fact that democracy is where we need to learn from or apply democracy to the tax reform process, right? It is a democratic process. We need to make sure that everyone's involved. And Eric, you've highlighted the moral grounds, which is to say that it is immoral to abuse tax systems. It is immoral to use financing. We are financing immoral actions. We're financing human rights abuses until we address these systems, until we make systematic change. So let's talk about specific changes, since action is my favorite topic. We are in a policy window of opportunity. Antonio, you've highlighted this. Here in Brazil, there is appetite, there's legislation, there is a moment in Kenya, there is a moment of opportunity here. And taking a step back, the UN Convention, the terms of reference, you've just come from these negotiations. So can you each please talk a little bit about what should civil society be doing to involve themselves in this policy window of opportunity? What should the IF20 be doing? What should government be doing? How does government want support from the people in this room even? I hope that coming out of the IF20, yes, we're having many conversations, but we are all sitting in a position of privilege to have these conversations. If we don't take these conversations into partnership, then everything we talk about today will be forgotten the moment you step outside that door. So I hope let's give some concrete ideas. I'll take notes from this panel. We can put together a list of recommendations that you could take into some of your meetings with the G20 this fall. Let's really narrow in on action that can be taken in this current policy window of opportunity, convention or otherwise. Eric, why don't you start with some of the ideas that you have?
Thank you, Rachel. And at the risk of offending the Undersecretary Antonio, I will say, as Rachel did, it's absolutely immoral when people are and companies are enriching themselves. We have kids around the world dying of preventable diseases. We don't know where the money is coming for the SDGs. We don't know where the money is coming for to heal our planet. We don't have the $30 billion we need to stop human trafficking. And we have really a relatively small group of human beings and corporations playing games to enrich themselves. Immoral as people of faith is the word you use, and especially as people of faith, if we really believe in the themes of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures and the scriptures that are important to us, which all have Jubilee themes that we need to be protected from having too little or too much. It's about our own health and well being as a world. And I think that first, as Rachel was asking, I think that's the most important thing that people of faith, the IF20, PART, and other groups need to do over the next few years with their engagement with the G20 and the G7, but frame these issues in a moral perspective, right? And use the numbers, right? It's fine. And we need to do that. We need to say these are moral issues when we have kids dying of preventable diseases and we have the money to stop it. So that's our role as people of faith. And as our engagement is growing and as we approach the Jubilee year, we have more power over the next 2 years to make demands of the G20, the G7, as well as inform the UN Tax Convention, which, as noted, the terms of reference were released last Friday, but unfortunately they don't have the support. So, some of the work of the G20 has been very important. So the G20 over the last 4 years has done good work on looking at issues of digital tax as well as corporate minimum tax. So I think one policy recommendation, and I'm going to guess that Antonio may agree with me, but part of what we have to do in pushing the G20 is say, great job on that corporate minimum tax, but it's way too low, right? It is way too low, and it's a step in the wrong direction, right? Yes, in northern countries, the OECD is helping to enforce that, and it helps curb some things, but it's not even as high as the standard corporate tax rate in the United States. So that's a huge policy recommendation. That's something we need to push the G20 on and work with our allies in the Brazilian government and others. Um, I also really want to give kudos to the Brazilian government because you've already achieved legacy with this G20 presidency. For the first time in history, you have mentioned in both ministerial finance minister documents the need for a global tax convention and also raising an agenda is the first time in history for real progressive taxation and a wealth tax. The people that are really utilizing tax evasion, the billionaires of the world. Again, that's legacy for the G20 presidency, and it starts us to move from soft law to hard law. So, I think we need to say that's very important that they got all of the finance ministers and the two important finance minister documents that you can look up. I won't read from them, and even a broader and stronger language in your G20 document on taxation on the ad hoc committee. That is really truly historic that you all got that done. It's a big deal. Um, and as that's getting done, I think we have a role to really push that in terms of kind of moral perspectives. I think a few other issues on tax that are also important for us to be looking at. I think that as important as the discussion is in the G20, and the G20 is the fora for these decisions, where we need to build a higher consensus is within the G7, right? So while the G20 is going to be able to control work of the International Monetary Fund and get us the votes we need to get things passed, it's the G7 countries, for the most part, that were against the terms of reference, on last Friday at the United Nations. So again, a very special role for the IF20 and the faith community, especially as we approach the Jubilee year and this time where 180 countries are starting organizing on Jubilee over the next 5 years. We have a special ability to push Southern and Northern governments to do more on this issue. So I think the last piece that I would mention, and the G20 is important, but it needs to be pushed in a number of fora to get it done, is we need to push harder on some of the progressive taxation and the wealth taxation of the billionaires, because there's so much money that's right there. So I'll leave it there, but I think those are a few concrete policy recommendations from what we've succeeded in, what we need to build on, and I think, of course, what are some new ideas and innovative ways to raise more money.
Thank you so much, Eric. There's some really important points there. So you've highlighted first and foremost transparency. Where is the money coming from to fund the 2030 agenda, the Summit of the Future? We need to be thinking about these tax structures. The role of IF20 in PARD is to frame the issues in a moral perspective and use the data, right? Moral issues will not carry the water to the end of the row if we don't have the data to support them. To continue to support the Brazilian government in their proposal for a wealth tax, which has huge international consensus, as Antonio highlighted, and then to continue to push the G7 around a higher buy-in from OECD countries to support this new tax convention, the terms of reference, raising the corporate minimum tax, and other important initiatives. Antonio, I'm saving you for last, so me skipping over you is not out of any disrespect. And let's turn to you, some specific policy action items from your perspective and from your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I agree with my co-presenter about the issue of transparency, which I've also highlighted. But I bring in the issue of those terms of reference. How well are they understood? Antonio talked about the language. Is it borrowed from the UN? Is it borrowed from the past? Or is it borrowed from the present? And what language is acceptable? We've had in those UN negotiations, and when it comes to voting, some countries either support or oppose, maybe because of the language that is being used. So we need also to look at the language, make those terms of reference transparent such that when they are presented, they are understood by all. And also, we also need to build the capacity of religious actors in those reforms. If they don't understand the language, at what angle or at what level will they be negotiating in terms of what is best for the least developed countries? We've heard about the OECD, which is often recognized as the countries for the rich, but they're also talking about inequalities. How do we bridge this gap so that at the end of the day, we are going to have a tax system that is fair, just, and that serves the planet that we want? The other issue is about now the consensus in terms of who should be on the table, especially when it comes to the G20 and the faith leaders in terms of representation. The panel we just had, it was talking about the vulnerable, to make sure that all groups are represented, especially when it comes to these negotiations. And when it comes now to the tax reforms that are going also to be progressive, not retrogressive. We've had, when taxes have been introduced in most of the governments, especially even what I talked about with Kenya, people are feeling that they are being oppressed. So we want a system that is going to bring progress rather than bring dissent and discontent among the populace.
Great. So we need education on the terms of reference. Where's the language coming from? How is it being incorporated? We need to build the capacity of religious leaders. I think that is a very specific recommendation we'll take to Cole Durham and Catherine Marshall. That is something the IF20 absolutely can use our platform for. We need to build consensus. We need to be thinking about progressive tax. All right, Antonio, please tell us your reactions to some of these policy recommendations and other policy recommendations where you need data, evidence. What other unanswered questions are there that we can use the remainder of our time on our panel thinking about, and also prepping you with the tools that you need to then go into the G20 meetings this fall?
Yes, thank you. I think one concrete action which we have been working already, and of course you're part of it, is engaging more and more civil society in these debates, and each civil society in each country to put pressure not only in the executive but also in the legislative. It's very important, because sometimes the executive wants to do progressivity because it brings popularity, brings more efficiency, brings more economic growth. But in the legislative, there are strong resistance. Powerful groups are represented in the legislative. Happens here, happens elsewhere around the world. So I think this use the moment, take this moment now to put pressure, since we're having this discussion at the UN, since the G20 opened a way for further discussion. We count on South Africa to also to keep this discussion at a high level. So I think this is very important because it can make a difference, this kind of engagement. Well, internally, of course, concrete action, tax reforms internally, of course, we are doing this here. Other countries are doing. I think Colombia did a very good one, and other countries are also engaged in internal reforms. If you allow me, I have some points here to talk about the negotiation at the UN. Is it okay for me to? Okay. Well, the process of negotiation in the convention is the result of the G77, with the African group playing an important, a fundamental role, a leading role. Their goal is to establish an inclusive, fair, transparent, efficient, equitable, and effective international tax system for sustainable development. This language is, we have lots of similar language this in the G20 declarations. The main points agreed on the second terms of reference discussions we just ended. The terms of reference set out specific points that will form the basis of the convention. The main ones are the commitments and early protocols, which are legally binding mechanisms. The approved text had commitments on fair allocation of taxing rights, including enterprises, which means taxing rights should be given, applied to countries where the service is consumed, where the service is provided, not on the origins of the companies that are providing the service and something. So it's much better for developing countries and it's fair. And also addressing illicit financial flows, of course, exchange of information, and effective taxation of high net worth individuals. So we have commitments on those four big areas. On the list of early protocols to be chosen by the next committee, there's a mechanism to ensure the effective taxation of high net worth individuals. This topic is a priority, of course, for civil society, for Brazil, and for other Latin American countries, and also other countries around the world. Future steps. These terms of reference will be presented in the General Assembly by the end of September, and a new committee will be formed to work on the convention. So we have this timeline, a General Assembly at the end of September. We'll keep pushing this debate on international taxation cooperation and moving forward with the agenda for taxing high net worth individuals. We believe the UN Framework Convention is a very important fundamental step to enhance more fair and inclusive tax systems and improve domestic capacities. Also, you must have the legislation and also the domestic capacities, and internationally also to apply the legislation, because those ultra rich people and the ultra rich corporations, the large corporation, they have ways to evade, ways to find ways to decrease the amount of taxes they pay. So increasing the capacity of tax systems, tax authorities is important also. So.
Thank you so much. We're going to go into some questions from the audience. This is your 5-minute warning. Start preparing your questions. We'll give a chance for everyone, including Father Charles, to reflect on this amazing conversation. We've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. So, Father Charles, we'll start with you and work back down the panel for some final thoughts before we take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. This is all very, very insightful. I want to sort of propose two thoughts, one for Anne and Eric, very quickly, under 1 minute each, and then you, Antonio. Let me start with you, Antonio. One of the key and thorny issues in this whole debate is the overall global financial architecture. And we have a global governance system that affects our finances, including taxation, that promotes lack of transparency, that promotes all of these things that we're talking about. The overall, we have these policy recommendations, but that's one thing. But we have also a global financial architectural system that still promotes these things, and it's still an ongoing conversation. And Africa has been very outspoken on this in the last few years. Yeah, and there's still a problem there. I don't know how the Brazilian presidents of the G20s has addressed itself to the issues around the injustices in the global financial architecture, the overall framework. Yeah. Okay. And then I'll ask Eric. This is something I picked up in the last conversation. In the plenary, they spoke about the moral courage, and Pope Francis speaks about another sickness where we have, like Eric said, we have enough of what it takes to do this, but we're not doing it. And Pope Francis calls that a spiritual crisis. We have all these crises, but underlying is a spiritual crisis, which was called lack of moral courage. Maybe could you speak to those two, to the spiritual crisis, Eric and Anne, and then you can speak to the global financial architecture issue. Yeah, we'll start with you. Yeah, the action needed or that is being moved to change the way finance works in the world.
So don't just solve tax reform. Can you also solve the entire global finance structure at the same time?
Well, it's challenging, but we would like to, and we are trying within the limits of our possibilities in a group such as the G20, which is consensus-based and which has strong activities of international organizations. You inherit legacies that you have to build on and so on. For example, where we took the presidency at the beginning of this year, we have on debts. You know, what happened on debts? Between 2010 and 2020, interest rates were very, very low. So many countries went out to the markets to get funding. So they went to the private markets and they went to the new lending countries. For example, you had the Paris Club original countries, which is the G7 plus a few other countries. Now you have also China, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates as new sources of financing. So there was a huge increase on debt by those countries because interest rates were very low. Then what happened in 2020? The pandemics. So the pandemics made a big blow to the economies. And after 1 year or something, inflation rose in the in developed economies. They raised interest rates. So those countries were with high levels of debt. And then the pandemic blew up their economies in many ways. And then finally, you had a sharp increase in interest rates. In 1 year, I think a 5% increase in interest rates. So it was a perfect storm on those countries. What the G20 did? Well, an initiative, I think, in 2021 to postpone debt service payments, the DSSI, and then, of course, the common framework. The common framework, we know all the criticisms that exist around the common framework, that it's too slow, that it's being too slow, it's not working properly. And we have been working on a note within the G20, a note which is called Lessons Learned from the Common Framework. So the lessons learned is a fundamental step so that you can build new possibilities, new possibilities for work. We also asked the UNCTAD to bring us a new ADEB report and with proposals. We had this in the middle of this year. And also the common framework. I know there are bolder proposals to do many other bolder things, but to do those things, you have to have the agreement of the main creditors. So you have to try to negotiate them and put them on board. The fact is that there are there are differences between older creditors from the Paris Club and new creditors. They're not in the Paris Club. So this requires an intense and delicate diplomatic construction. Brazil's trying. We are trying. We are having this note on the lessons learned, and we presented proposals with the UNCTAD reports. We would like to do more. Yes, we would like to do more, but we are a very small creditor, very, very small, and a very small debtor also. So uh, we are not the strongest player in this field. So what we can do is to publish and to discuss and to debate and to present alternatives, but the implementation depends on forces that are beyond our control. And again, civil society is pushing hard for reforms on a common framework, on other aspects. And I think that's the way we must proceed because interest rates are still high. They will remain high, I think, unfortunately, for some time. And developing countries are increasingly overburdened with debt service and debt levels. And this is recognized by the IMF, by the World Bank, by all main institutions from the establishment. This is not something that is not considered, but we have to work for international solutions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Eric, how can faith groups, faith leaders help the hearts of our leaders? Not just tell them what to do. How can we support them? They say if you want to make people move, speak to their hearts. How can we speak to their hearts to support this moral courage in our global leaders?
Well, I think certainly as Anne has raised as a recommendation, building the capacity among faith leaders is essential. And we've seen a lot of that happen on debt in particular over the years. But tax is really a new issue. And, you know, sometimes it's easy for society to forget really how much education faith leaders have. You know, we look at science degrees or math degrees or whatever, but we don't realize that the ministry, the divinity, the pastoral degrees that religious leaders have are every single bit as hard and complicated and scientific driven as any other degree. And so on debt and taxes, we've been working with faith leaders. The reality is faith leaders pick it up really quickly. And what faith leaders are able to do once they pick it up is speak from the moral authority because they're running hospitals, they're running schools, they're able to speak from that perspective. But not only do they speak technically, but they also have the moral voice and ability to talk about how children are impacted, how the planet is impacted. I think part of what Father Charlie was raising, which is very interesting about the commentaries from Pope Francis, is specifically on tax, on debt, these questions that we know God has given us enough, but we're not sharing those resources amongst us. What Pope Francis has really been getting into in a lot of these economic issues during his papacy is the concept of social sin. So I know in faith traditions we have a distinction on how we might look at sin. The majority of Christian traditions certainly look at sin in terms of personal responsibility. But I think when we're talking about the inability to stop trillions of dollars from getting where it needs to go to deal with the greatest crises and challenges of our time, we're really no longer talking about personal sin, we're talking about social sin. And I think being able to frame those things to world leaders and decision makers is absolutely critical. And we have the moral authority to do it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
Thank you. And I totally agree with my speakers that religious leaders, they have the moral authority, and also they are the one who plays the prophetic role. Our leaders listen more when the religious leaders speak. And the spiritual crisis, it comes when they are unable to exercise their moral authority and also to speak openly and speak truth to power, to go and tell those who are dealing with illicit financial flows, tax evaders and tax avoiders, all of them. The religious leaders are going to listen to them. The leaders, they're going to listen to the religious leaders when they get that confidence to speak with moral authority. There are so many systems that manifest in that, such that they don't feel protected. She talked about the issues of human rights. You find that when you go to speak to the leader, the next time you hear the person has been kidnapped, the person has been detained, accused of crimes that the person never committed. So they are all manifested in all different forms. But as religious leaders, we need to build their capacity. Once they understand what is at stake, and once they understand what is happening and where they need to get into, it becomes very easy for them to raise their voice without fear, because number one, they understand about their right. There is freedom. And also even there are also institutions that also are there. As we talk also about tax reforms, we should not also not forget about the institutional reforms, because these institutions are also responsible for distributing the tax that is collected. And these institutions also, they're also going to give power to the religious leaders, especially the judiciary, such that if I see some wrongs happening, I can stand here, talk truth to power, and that I'm protected by the law in that country.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We'll go into questions now. So I know we have a question here, and in the back. We'll take all 3 questions. We'll take all 4 questions and give our panelists an opportunity to respond. So if we can get the roaming mic, please keep your question brief and succinct so we can get in all 4. Thank you.
Boa tarde. Meu nome é Samuel Luz, sou presidente da Associação Brasileira de Liberdade Religiosa e Cidadania. Meu nome é Samuel Luz, sou presidente da Associação Brasileira de Liberdade Religiosa e Cidadania, em que pese essa macrovisão tributária que foi apresentada, eu quero fazer um recorte da Constituição do Brasil, que estabelece a imunidade tributária dos templos de qualquer culto, ou seja, das organizações religiosas. E também a isenção tributária dada pelos governos em função da natureza do trabalho social feito pelas organizações religiosas. Todavia, na discussão da reforma tributária do Brasil, há um movimento querendo subtrair, tirar essa imunidade que está direcionada às organizações religiosas e também as isenções que são dadas pelos governos estaduais, federal, estadual e municipal. Em que pese essa macrovisão, como essa política tributária do Brasil, na visão de vocês, se insere nessa discussão? Muito obrigado.
Okay, so I'll give you a translation of what we said, but we'll take the other 3 questions first. So to the next gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Zakaria from Ghana. Though I'm here on behalf of African Union Interfaith, but I'm speaking as an expert in finance, in public financial management. Looking at reforms that will work, the first thing I will say is that there should be a total cancellation of all incentives, especially to multilateral organizations. They use their burden to be able to enter countries and then make the other local organization unpopular. So once there is a total cancellation, that is one of the steps forward towards reforms. Then criminalization of tax evasion and total restriction of tax avoidance. If we are able to get this work together, then the stiffer the punishment, the more people will not go to evade tax. Then thirdly, it must also be progressive rather than regressive. Because even if you have to tax billionaires, you have to be very careful because they are providing a lot of opportunities. So it must be progressive rather than regressive. Then more importantly, we must also look at the issue of their role in corporate social responsibilities if we are going to tax billionaires. What is the percentage of their profit that goes towards corporate social responsibility? And then finally, if we are able ourselves to put in place physical discipline across board, you cannot be taking people's money and using it for recurrent expenditure rather than taking steps of value-added construction that will bring in more money. Most of the time, tax is taken, but rather go on recurrent expenditure.
Okay.
Transparency. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Next question here.
Meu nome é Werton Brasil. O tema é reformas globais de tributação. Eu só concebo esse tema na medida em que países promovem suas reformas, mas ao mesmo tempo há uma grande concertação internacional, porque no Brasil, por exemplo, estamos a finalizar a reforma tributária, essa nossa, que é boa em vários aspectos, mas ela não muda a lógica perversa do nosso sistema, que é regressivo. Os impostos sobre o consumo oferecem mais receitas no total da receita tributária do que os impostos sobre a propriedade e a renda. E, em termos internacionais, por mais que um país pobre tenha um sistema tributário justo, ele vai produzir alguma justiça tributária internamente, mas ele vai continuar sendo um país pobre. Por isso, eu coloco para os senhores e senhoras da mesa a questão dos impostos sobre as grandes transações internacionais, sobre os grandes fluxos de capitais internacionais, que há uma grande resistência dos países ricos. Eu vejo nessa uma grande possibilidade de devolver para os países pobres aquilo que eles perdem de riqueza. Eu peço que comentem.
Thank you, sir. And the final question, the woman here in the front.
As we know, in most developing countries, taxation has widened the economic inequality gap. So how do we make taxation attractive in these developing countries?
Thank you so much. Okay, panelists, we have 4 excellent questions here. The first from the gentleman in the back is about the special status of religious groups and tax systems. So most countries, not all, give churches and religious groups a tax-exempt status, and there is threat in Brazil and in other countries that might be repealed. That might not be as an attractive financing program in light of the fact that we're trying to redistribute wealth, and certainly there is a lot of wealth concentrated in religious groups. So commentary on the tax-exempt status of these religious groups and whether that should be kept, taken away. The second question or comment about taxing billionaires, making it progressive, incorporating corporate social responsibility, making sure that we know how the money will be used. So any final comments on that? The third question, thinking about a lot of different things were mentioned by the gentleman here, but the different aspects of regressive logic, tax consumption, properties, tax justice, commentaries on tax justice and the different components that we should be considering there. And lastly, making taxation attractive. So we'll start with Eric, if you want to address pieces of those questions or parts, and we'll work down the line. Eric, to you.
Well, let me make 2 comments. And the first question that was raised, I think, is a very fine question. And actually, Rachel and I, over dinner last night with colleagues, were actually talking about this particular question. The reality is that many of us are part of charitable and religious organizations, and we have special tax statuses. And so if we get the question, well, you're not fully paying taxes at Jubilee USA, or you get tax deductions for when you buy office supplies, right? The response is very simple from my perspective. If a religious institution, if a nonprofit is using that entity as a tax shelter to enrich themselves. Their tax status should be removed. That's simple. But if religious institutions and charitable institutions are on the front lines of promoting the common good and investing that money in people, we should not be looking at taking away those statuses because they're already investing their money in people. So I mean, I think that's the reality, and that's also what we have to tell people when we get those questions. The other piece is when we really talk about the amount of money that is within charitable statuses, it's dwarfed by the billionaires. It's dwarfed by corporate tax evasion and avoidance. In many ways, it's kind of a shell issue in and of itself. One other piece that I would just comment on that I think relates to the importance of tax issues and the very issues that are being raised during this G20 goes back to our work at Jubilee with the major religious leaders of the island of Grenada, an island of 110,000 people, where we were able to broker with the religious leaders an innovative way to be able to deal with the island's debt crisis and continuous ways that it was hitting hurricanes. One of the great things we did during that, which was just activated, is on private bond contracts, we were able to put in a hurricane clause. So the hurricane that hit Grenada, because we were the first to get it in that country, and now it's being used in other places, they're not going to pay any of their debt for the next 6 months, right, for rebuilding. So they've activated their hurricane clause. That's an aside to how we got the real debt restructuring done in Grenada by saving jobs, by keeping people employed, not doing the usual things that the International Monetary Fund wants to do by laying off. And the way we did it was we worked with the Grenadian government to go after the low-hanging fruit. On the island of Grenada, lawyers, doctors, and corporations were not paying their taxes. They weren't even being asked to pay their taxes. By curbing tax avoidance and evasion on the island of Grenada, we had the resources to save public sector jobs. We had the resources not to cut in the national healthcare system. We had the resources to actually start investing more money in the environment in Grenada. And we did that in that debt restructuring by dealing with tax avoidance and tax evasion.
Thanks, Eric. Antonio, over to you for any of the question components.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your questions. On the first question on the tax exemptions for religious institutions. Well, I understand it's been discussed on Congress. I understand there are legislators that are probably want to keep the exemptions, legislators that might want to decrease them or might want to increase them, and it's up to Congress. I don't see. It's really a little bit beyond my mandate, and I am not personally, and my secretary is not involved personally in the negotiations in Congress. I wouldn't like to. I don't have a strong opinion. Actually, I don't know what's the current stage of the discussion technically on this issue. So I'm sorry. On the second intervention on the taxation of billionaires and the progressivity, we fully agree with your statements, with your points, and all the taxation of large international transactions. This is well, we had the proposal of the Tobin tax since the 19th or something, and we are very open to discuss such things. I think that the amount of wealth or financial assets, it's absolutely disproportional to the real economy assets that we have. So we have a large disparity because of financial instruments, because of ways that financial actors have to multiply the assets and without a real connection with the global economy. So this is something that has been strongly in the agenda in the past. And even the IMF has changed its view on capital controls on a few issues, and it's a discussion that we deem very, very important. And well, in that attractiveness of taxation, I think taxation is fundamental. You know, it's something that as I mentioned, it's at the core of the way our social societies are structured, in the core of the democracies. Normally, we have a view only on the way money is spent, on the priorities, on corruption, on other issues. But the way money is collected, revenues are collected, from whom it is collected, how, and in which proportion. This is absolutely central. I think this is a matter of increasing attention internationally and domestically, and that's the way forward. Also to increase the fiscal space of governments, and that's something that when you increase the fiscal base, you can increase social spending, and this can limit or at least diminish the space for populist narratives to come up in the political arena. So this is also something important in my view.
Thank you very much. Anne?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I totally agree, especially with the proposals that have been floated, especially for the first question. It's also a debate even in our countries, especially the status of religious institutions. Should they be taxed? And especially what they collect every Sunday. In Kenya, you find churches collect even 3 million, 4 million, some collect even 50 million. But do they pay tax, or should that offering be taxed? It's still a debate. Currently, there's a bill in Parliament where they're looking at even can they regulate these churches? When they come to regulations, it's going to come with measures, even how they're going to be taxed or whether they're going to pay taxes and up to what percentage. And what percentage, is it 30% like any other pay as you earn, or is it 15%, or is it 5% withholding tax? So still, even in our countries, it's a debate, but we also concur with the fact that if that money is being used for the benefit of the people, to offer services to the people, also we see the benefit that whatever that is corrected from those churches is going to do. We've seen them offering education institutions are sponsored by churches. We have hospitals, we have schools, they're even sponsoring children's homes and even homes for the elderly and all that. So there's a lot that they do, but also even in our countries is still a debate that is still going on, whether religious institutions should be taxed or not, or should they pay tax. It all ties to the bottom line of accountability and transparency. Some also, they don't even disclose what they earn or what they give. When it comes to the issue of the cancellation of incentives, the criminalizations of tax evaders, what other countries have done, especially in our country, is digitization of the tax system to seal all loopholes. You find systems such as e-commerce, e-invoicing, e-receipting, such that everything is digitized whenever, and there are no loopholes when it comes to the tax that is collected. And when the taxpayers cars, they're able to extract from the system how much tax was generated from the sales and how much it's due to the taxpayer, and that is what is paid. That is also something that has really worked, and also something that can really work. In one of the terms of reference, the issue of negotiations, I saw also there's a point on digitization of taxation, which is also going to help close all these loopholes. The issue of criminalization, it also goes with the other institutions that are responsible for enforcement. We know these billionaires, they have the money. If you arrest them, you take them to court, they have the money to pay the judges, to pay the police, and they're released the next day, and they go back to continuing with the work. So it's an all-inclusive process that requires also even other multi-stakeholders and multi-actors, so that we can seal this loophole. When it comes to tax incentives, we all agree that tax is important. The only thing that can attract is the brackets that are installed or that are instituted between who pays what percentage and at what level. But also, to make tax attractive, we need also to see the services. If I pay my taxes, I want to see services delivered to me. And that's why, for example, in our country, we found people protesting because they are paying taxes, but they're not seeing the services being offered to them. So if you are going to tax me, I want to make sure that tomorrow I get the services that I deserve. That's the only way that is going to motivate me to pay tax as a responsible citizen. Thank you.
Father Charles, do you want to make any final comments?
No, it's just to appreciate the panel for those very insightful remarks, and I'm sure that they have sparked a conversation that will go on, and I'm very sure that we are going out enriched by
Absolutely.
these very important remarks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I second that. And let me just say that we'll take the comments that were shared here today. We will put forward some recommendations. Antonio, I'll stay in contact with you and make sure the panelists have an opportunity to share on behalf of the IF20 and PART and anyone else who wants to be part of those conversations. We'll model what we are preaching from this pulpit, which is that we can educate, we can inform, and then ultimately make recommendations to the government of Brazil as chair of G20, but also to our respective countries' governments. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to our panelists, and thank you for joining us.